All right, we are back with the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan, here with my part-time co-host for this season, Mitchell Salazar. Mitch, lots of late nights for us on the West Coast for the third stop of the 2024 WSL Championship Tour season, the Mayo Rip Curl Pro Portugal, coming down to the final day of the window. It finished with a bang, though. We had Reunion Islands' Joanne Defay and San Clemente's Griffin Colapinto walk away with the hardware. Sharp Eye vaulted into pole position on the current Vissla CT Shaper Rankings. The front runners stumble. Medina returns. A lot went down. Mitch, you and I are recording a couple of days removed from the final day in Portugal. Time to digest. How are you feeling about what you saw in Europe?
I'm pretty stoked, to be honest, Dave. I think this event was a clear understanding of why the Championship Tour is so diverse nowadays and so competitive, too. I mean, if you just look at the round of 16 alone on the men's side, a ton of people who hadn't been there before. Cole Houshman finally breaks through, gets a 9th place finish here. Crosby makes it all the way to the semifinals, which is huge for him in terms of requalifying and even for Rookie of the Year status, too. Really, really impressed with Ramsey Bukiam, makes it into the quarters and had a couple great heats too, by the way. Ethan Ewing makes the finals. And on the other side, João Dudu as a big upset on the men's side, I would say, making it to the quarters. Defeats Rio Waida literally in the last few seconds too. And obviously you got to talk about the champions, Joanne Defay and Griffin Colapinto, the two most consistent surfers throughout the event. It was a sick one in Portugal, Dave.
I feel exactly the same. I think it's actually one of the most exciting season starts we've had in recent memories. So let's get to the opening segment. We have winners and losers. We will start with our losers. Mitch, who do you have first?
Yeah, well, it's the top seeds on the women's side. Molly Picklum, who's number one coming into the event, and Caitlin Simmers both lose out fairly early given the circumstances of where they were sitting in the rankings coming into Portugal. I still think that Molly Picklum is the best female surfer on the planet. And I also think that Caitlin Simmers is complete enough to win a world championship at the end of this year. But you don't want to go into the last few events before the mid-year cut in a position where you're not necessarily in the front running for 1, 2, or 3. Because remember, there's a lot of events in the back end of the year now, Dave, that are not only set up differently, including Tahiti, which is number 6, rather than being the last event of the year, but most importantly, the addition of Fiji, too. And a lot of these women haven't necessarily competed or even free surfed there, so I think it's going to be very beneficial to a lot of the veterans on tour, such as Sally, Joanne Defay, who's won there before, Tati, who also got a good result, to move into those last few events of the year being front runners. And now Molly and Katie, well, they need to get back on track over at Bells.
It's a great one. I think there is a lot of missed opportunity in Portugal. My first loser coming out of that event are the Aussie males, with the exception of the Ethan Ewing carve-out, who moved up to world number 2 with his runner-up finish at Super Tubos. But the other 5 Australian males on tour, you got Robinson, O'Brien, Callanan, Wilcox, and Robson. They all saw their standings fall a collective 24 positions on the CT rankings. Obviously, not what that group wanted to set out to accomplish in Portugal, but the silver lining is they are heading home to familiar sands for the next 2 events with Bells Beach and Margaret River. So they've got their flat whites and meat pies, Vegemite, Tim Tams. Everything's on tap. You got world-class waves, world-class surfing communities. So they'll be positioned to rebound here in the next couple of weeks, so should they take the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, never been a huge fan of Vegemite, but I feel that, going into the event, it's been a good one for a lot of these surfers. Robinson, he had that incredible heat with Italo a few years ago over there at Bells. Callum Robson's been a finalist at Bells before. Ethan Ewing, you mentioned his runner-up finish here. He won Bells last year, so he had a chance to be world number 1 heading into Bells if he would have won the final here. Unfortunately gets second place, but he's still got to be very content with the result and being within the top 5 spots right now. But I have a very similar loser, but instead of the Aussies, it's the Brazilian veterans on the men's side. Both Pupo brothers in a position where they've been so before. Sammy last year got knocked off tour, had to requalify, ended up winning 2 Challenger Series events. But Miguel, we haven't seen him compete at the highest level for a few years due to an injury. So it seems like it's been a few events since he started to assimilate and kind of understand the format of competing again at this level on the Championship Tour. And I think the most important thing about Miguel is that he's had to lose his seeding because of that injury too. A lot of people didn't realize that he was number 6 at the end of 2022, but with the injury, he got dropped down a significant amount of spots. So that means his heats have been a lot harder for him, whether that he's going up against the higher seeds or against people in the mid-pack. He needs to make up for it And another person too, David Silva. I mean, he's had a couple of good heats, but he hasn't been able to break through with anything better than a ninth place finish so far. So losing to Ethan Ewing in the round of 32, it was a good heat. He was leading for a quick moment. And then you also have Caio Belli, who had been a standout in Hawaii for several seasons. He's back in the rankings at the bottom spot, and I feel like he definitely needs two good results over at Bells and Margaret River, which historically have been two good events for him, but he's needing massive ones in the next two events, Dave.
You mentioned it already, but the tour is so diverse right now in terms of world-class talent. Anyone can win any heat, and even all these names we're listing, in the loser column or that are below the rankings right now, every single one of them is a proven performer and has shown flashes of brilliance. Caio, for example, is deadly at Bells Beach and Margaret River. Could easily win both of those events back to back. We'll just see how it shakes up. My second loser coming from Peniche, you covered this one a little bit, but it's the front runners. On the women's side, Molly Picklum and Katie Simmers both lost ground in Portugal. And with Katie coming into that event as the defending event winner, losing in the round of 16. It wasn't what she or what I'm sure many fantasy team owners expected from her. And then on the men's side, John goes down to Jake Marshall in the round of 16 as well. Really good heat between the two of them. John looked so sharp and so locked in. And I actually think that's just credit to Jake. He is so dangerous. He got the opportunity, sent Florence packing. I'm really looking forward to seeing how these aforementioned surfers recover in Australia. It's been such an exciting season so far, and things feel like they're really condensing, not only at the top, but around that relegation line too.
Yeah, I got to give a big shout out to Jake. I mean, he surfed his ass off in that heat against John. I mean, he was backed up against the wall for a good portion of the heat, Dave, and dropped the hammer with two major carves on that wave. I mean, knocked John out, and most importantly, got his best result of the year when we're talking about somebody who really thrives in bigger conditions, had to adjust at a beach break. And remember, he's made the final at the U.S. Open before, had a good season on the Challengers once he got knocked off last year. I wouldn't be surprised to see him make a push for the top 15 at the end of 2024. And, my last loser, I hope this doesn't upset anybody or it doesn't burn any bridges, but I just think it's a lack of funding for major events in Europe. It's only been a few years since we haven't seen France on the World Championship Tour. We no longer have a Challenger Series event over there. And having only Portugal as our only championship tour and CS level event, I mean, come on, dude. There's a lot of Europeans that need an opportunity to be able to compete on the largest stage available, and that's what the Challenger Series and the Championship Tour are. France need to step it up. I think Spain has a lot of funding that they really need to push and get a lot of their young surfers up and coming too on these platforms, because eventually the only way you're going to be able to get these surfers on tour is by having these events in your region too. It happened with Brazil, it happened with the United States too, and it's obviously happened with Australia in the last few years, but I think Europe needs to step it up a bit more because Portugal, I mean, they're just blowing things out of the water, Dave.
It's a great point, and you brought up those other examples. Like anytime we have a region or a community with a lot of talent, that talent, time and time again, only matriculate to that elite level and start winning world titles on the back of a very strong domestic competitive circuit at all levels, right? Pro, junior, QS, CS, CT. It gives every surfer in that community, in that region, not only the opportunity to develop those competitive chops, but to see world-class surfing in the flesh when it comes to their sands. And that's pretty invaluable. So I think that's a great call out. My final loser coming out of Super Tubos is actually the rookie class. With relegation approaching in two events, we currently have Cole Hauschman, Eli Hanneman, Cade Matson, Jacob Wilcox, Sawyer Lindblad, and Alyssa Spencer below the cut line. And it is a harsh game, right, for everyone at the bottom of the ranking. You talked about the seeding. You talked about what an impact that can have on a surfer, not just as they move through the event, but from the start of the event. They have to come up against these world beaters early on. It makes it very, very difficult. But as we talked about, every single one of these surfers has shown flashes that prove they can absolutely perform at this level of competition. And we'll see. We'll see over the next couple of events if they can join their fellow rookie classmen currently sitting above the cut. We mentioned Crosby Colapinto, and then West Oz's Jacob Wilcox is currently qualifying for the back half of the season. So we'll see what happens with our rookies. But pivoting a little bit, Mitch, who have you got for your first winner coming out of the Mayo Rip Curl Pro Portugal?
Well, I do want to say that Sori Lindblad had an amazing heat against Caroline Marks over at Mola Leste. Like, it was a back and forth heat, and I think Caroline demonstrated why she's the current world champion in that heat. I mean, both of them had more than excellent heat totals, but most importantly, it just proved why we see such a difference between the person that's number one in the world in comparison to the people that are number 10 or 11 because they're able to switch it on when it really matters. So Caroline proving that she's kind of where Sawyer was at a certain point, and now on her 60th year on tour, she looks great. My first winner has to be the Colapinto brothers. I mean, they both make it to finals day. San Clemente must be very proud of these young kids, and Crosby getting a semifinal finish, loses to runner-up of the event, Ethan Ewing. Great performance by him. I felt like he competed very well. A lot of strategic and smart decision making. But most importantly, coming up against Cole Houshman in the round of 16 was not an easy heat. And it's always more difficult when you're coming up against a friend, too. I've had a lot of heats like those before. Those are the ones you definitely don't want to lose because there's a lot of smack talking afterwards once it happens. But Cole is lethal and dangerous, and especially when it comes to a beach pick like that matches power with power. Crosby understood that he needed to keep him off of the best waves in the heat and eventually found his rhythm, was able to get into the semifinals. Now, shifting over to his brother, no doubt the most consistent surfer out of the event, but most importantly, had a major rebound too, Dave. Opening round heat, loses with the priority interference over Callum Robson in the final seconds of the heat, and after that, won every single heat he surfed in. So, stand-up performance by Griff, 2 wins in the last 3 years by him, and his lowest heat total out of the event outside of the opening round, 13.43, and left it all at the end with the 9.67 in the final. Good stuff.
I like it. And you and I must be real simpatico because that's my first winner out of Portugal as well, the Colapinto brothers. And I think we, as surf fans, we almost had our first sibling final since I'm thinking it's Bruce and Andy Irons in France in 2004. So that would have been 20 years, unless I'm missing a sibling final in there somewhere. I don't think I am. And it would have been in Europe again. But Crosby, he went down to Ethan in the semifinals. Griffin redeems the family by beating Ethan in the final, collects the event win, vaults 10 spots up the rankings, and is now in the yellow leader jersey heading into Australia. You pointed out Crosby elevates 7 places up to 10th and inside the cut line, heading into Bells Beach, which is his main sponsor, Rip Curl's hometown. So he'll have all the support there in Torquay, Janjuk. He'll have it be like a second home for him. So yeah, big Colapinto energy coming out of Europe. Credit to Tom Whitaker, their coach. Credit to Troy Eckert, their mental, spiritual guru. But yeah, big day for the power of positive thinking. And if we see more meditation from the top CT surfers moving forward on tour, it wouldn't shock me.
Well, and let's consider, too, that maybe Crosby hasn't surfed at Bells as a wild card before, but he spent plenty of years there, as he mentioned. Main sponsor, Rip Curl, is a sponsor of the event. Had a lot of free surfing sessions right there, and he's been able to look at the best surfer in the world compete, both at Bells and at Winky Pop, I must say, too, because last year the event finished at Winky Pop, where Ethan beat Ryan Kellen in the final. I think it's going to be a big event for him, and then you go over to Margaret River. That should also be a very favorable wave for his style. Speaking of great styles and somebody that made miraculous decisions after a tough opening round loss heat, Gabe Medina is my second winner, and not only was he the best surfer in the event up until the semifinals, he just looked incredible. I mean, 18-point heat total against Leo Fioravanti in the quarterfinals, had 2 9s. I just have to say, this is the best I've seen Gabe surf since Tahiti, and he's found his rhythm. Hasn't won before at Bells Beach, but moving up on the leaderboard drastically. 2 events that are coming up where he's won at Margaret River before, and he has something to prove. But big factor right here, Tahiti being in the mid part of the year rather than at the back end. He doesn't have to have that extra pressure like he had last year trying to qualify for the finals. I feel like this is going to be a great back end of the year for Medina, Dave.
I love it. And I love having a motivated Medina back on tour, back within the cut line. Obviously, Hawaii didn't go the way he wanted. I think he even said, the opening round heat in Portugal, he was so tired from surfing so many heats in the ISAs to earn his spot to Chopu for the Paris 2024 games. We were all worried. We're like, oh my gosh, man, if he doesn't get through, what's going to happen? But time and time again, venue and venue again, it almost seems like he is unbeatable when he's on. He's so strong and he's so talented. Yep. And it's Interesting seeing where he's at in the rankings right now. He's kind of right in the middle of the pack. But that's just having this like crazy juggernaut energy, both on one side of the cut line, but not within the top 5 yet. And as you pointed out, with Tahiti moving earlier in the calendar, he's amazing there. Then you go to El Salvador, Rio, home country. Fiji's on the calendar this year, where he's got to be one of the event favorites. Like, watching him march through the ranks through these next few events will be something to behold. And I'm glad you named him. But yeah, my second winner coming out of not just Portugal, but the first 3 events of the season is actually the tour traveling crew. Now, look, Mitch, you and I, we've been road warriors for the sport for years, and I think we both consider ourselves really fortunate to have, you know, the opportunities and the experiences that traveling on tour has given us. It can be amazing, but it's worth stressing. It's still work, and it's not always the quote-unquote dream tour, especially for those who are working behind the scenes to steward the platform for the world's best surfing. You have long days, you got long nights, there's a lot of calls, lots of energy is committed to ensuring these events are well executed and showcased. And in 2024, all 3 CT events so far have gone all the way to the last day of the window. I can't remember a year where that's happened. So, you know, a huge thank you and a congratulations to everyone that works on the road. You know, the tours and competition team, which was led by Renato Hickel there in Portugal, the officiating team led by Luli Pereira, broadcast team led by Jed Pearson, the security teams, event teams, water safety teams, sponsorship teams. You know, people have been working so hard this year, and we've all benefited from it. It's been one of the most exciting season starts I can remember.
No, 100%. I mean, and that's a great call out. I also want to say a big thank you to all the local volunteers and especially the medical staff too. Without them, a lot of these events wouldn't be as possible. And I think, you know, the first 3 events of the year are always complicated ones because you're going to locations that are usually very heavy. I know Dr. Spencer Chang came on the broadcast during Sunset, and he's like, yeah, you usually won't see as many bad injuries at Sunset that you'll see at Pipe. And I was working the broadcast, I was like, hey, Doc, like, I don't know about you, but I've surfed Sunset a lot of times before, and I've seen a lot of people get injured out there, including myself. So let's kind of tone it down a little bit, and let's understand where we're coming from when we're surfing a lot of these waves, because Portugal, even on the last day of the afternoon, got significantly large. So I just want to say, you know, all these people working behind the scenes, you guys crush it, and you're really the heart and soul of these events. The athletes really appreciate it, and obviously the fans have to appreciate it too, because those are the people that are watching it the most. Getting to my 3rd winner now, and this is something that I've touched on before, but I just think it's the Europeans overall. Joanne Defay coming out the champion. By the way, her first major win in Europe too, which is quite incredible given that she's been on tour for 10 years now. Leo Fioravanti makes the quarterfinals. Good a result for him in home in Europe. And Joan Leroux, a major threat when it comes to heavy barreling waves. He's qualified for Paris. People got to watch out if it's big over there. He's going to be a threat. But he makes it into the quarters, and he's kind of one of those silent assassin, beat Durbridge kind of type of surfers where he's good everywhere, but he just makes it through heats, and all of a sudden he makes it all the way to the final. He beat Rio Waida when Rio was competing extremely well at this event. And in that heat in the round of 16 against the Indonesian surfer, I mean, waited till the last few seconds to get a barrel, made it through at the end of the heat, and he almost beat Griffin in that quarterfinal matchup. So big props to the European surfers, handling the pressure of competing at home, having all the friends and family right there on the beach. I also want to give major props to Ramsey Bukim. I know he's actually from Africa, Morocco, part of North Africa, but I mean, he's competed in Europe for the majority of his life. I felt like he handled and managed all the pressure and expectations on his shoulder very well, made it into the quarters, and it's his best result to date, Dave.
A great one. The Europeans were so impressive, and you even called out it is challenging sometimes competing at home with the pressure. You know, that's a double-edged sword. It's like, I'm familiar, I'm sleeping in my own bed, I speak the language, but then you have you're not so much an underdog anymore. And sometimes being an underdog can really take the pressure off.
True.
And so great call out there. You know, my final winner is coming out of Portugal, and for sure we're going to dive into this in our upcoming segment, but Sharp Eye and Lost Surfboards. At the Mayo Rip Curl Pro Portugal, both programs collected 5 results apiece. You know, Sharp Eye is now out to a commanding lead on the current Vissla CT Shaper rankings. The defending CT Shaper of the Year, Matt Biolos and Lost Surfboards, they move up to number 2, coming from outside the top 5 after Hawaii. So exciting movement already in this year's Shaping World title race, and I'm looking forward to seeing who performs and if the Australian-based surfers like DHD and JS are able to make up some ground on familiar sands at Bells Beach and Margaret River in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out. Sharp, I had a major event. I mean, it's been a few times since we've seen them in the number one spot at the end of an event, especially this early in the season. But they had a good amount of surfers in both quarterfinals on the men's and women's side. I think it's going to be a good Australian leg for them, too, if they're able to get a lot of people through the mid-year cut, Dave.
100%. So we're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. All right, we are back. This is the Lineup Podcast. I'm Dave Prodan here with Mitchell Salazar. It is now time for the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings update.
Shaper Ranking!
Just background for our listeners. The Shapers on tour, they're given points based off the performances of surfers that ride their boards that finish in the quarterfinals or better. It is a combined rankings, men's and women's. The higher the surfer places, the more points the Shaper receives. We are tracking the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings from Event 1 through Event 10, and we will crown the CT Shaper of the Year before the WSL Finals. That program will also be gifted an overnight stay and surf at the Kelly Slater Surf Ranch in Lemoore, courtesy of the WSL and the Kelly Slater Wave Company. So, when the dust had settled on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings post Mayo Rip Curl Pro Portugal, it was Marcio Zuvi, Brendan Leckie, Yufu Penrose, and the entire Sharp Eye team that deserve a lot of credit for having a monster event in Europe. They got 5 results, quarterfinals or better, a win from Joanne Defay on the women's side, and now they are the front runners on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings heading into Australia, moving up from 3rd where they're sitting before the Portugal event. As we mentioned before the break, Matt Biolos and the Lost Surfboards program, the defending Shaper of the Year, have rocketed up to 2nd with 5 results of their own and a win from Griffin Colapinto on the men's side. Lost Surfboards, they weren't even in the top 5 before Portugal, and now they're in the front runners' rear view heading into Bells Beach, so good movement from them. Mitch, what did you notice on the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings in Europe?
Well, first things first, we got to address that. I know we're only in year 2, but I didn't expect the person who was champion the year before to drop down so many spots in the first few events of the year and make up for it in event number 3. So I think that's one big thing to point out right there. But my major pickup was obviously the improvements that Mayhem did with their team. But Sharp Eye, they are in a commanding lead right now. Nearly 7,000 points the difference between 1st and 2nd. And then you go from 2nd to 3rd, which is lost all the way to DHD. There's 12,000 points as a difference right there. So major differences. There's 3 Sharp Eye riders on the women's side that are currently in the top 10. If they are able to maintain that, it's going to be significant for them, especially if Joanne Defay can stay in the 1 or 2 spots heading in to Margaret River. I think most importantly, that's where we've seen a lot of struggles from the Sharp Eye team in the previous year. Now, shift over to the men's side. Look at the quarterfinals. Crosby, you have Griffin, you have somebody like Gabe Medina, who isn't really going to be in the top running unless he wins every single event for Johnny Cabianca. But Jake Marshall, Sharp Eye guy. Cano was right there, but you have Leo, who also made it for Sharp Eye into the quarterfinals. Joan Deroux, big performance as a wild card for the Mayhem and Lost Surfboards team. So big upsets, and once again, the diversity of people on tour makes things exciting. It also makes the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings even more exciting because you have people that have nothing to lose and everything to gain that are also adding a lot of valuable points to their Shapers too. So this is where I feel it all comes down to being in rhythm with the ocean during a competition. And that's what definitely happened with both Joanne Defay and Griffin Colapinto when they ended up winning this event here in Peniche.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Sharp Eye women's team, right, which we talked about all last year, they were so dominant on the men's side, but their women's program last year, Joanne was hurt. Tatiana had an off year for her. It was really their Achilles heel in 2023. So far in 2024, it is leading the way, right? We mentioned Joanne Defay with the win, but Tatiana had a semis finish. Luana Silva had a quarterfinals. It's very interesting how, Yufu and Brendan and Marcio have bounced back after 2023. One thing that I was curious to get your take on, Mitch, was in terms of the equipment that the surfers were riding there. Obviously, different waves, right? We're at Super Tubos, we're at Moy Lest. It's big, it's small, it's windy, it's onshore, there's barrels. What did you notice as a competitor yourself that they were using? Was there anything that stood out, or was everyone really kind of going back to their safe spaces where this is my Ferrari all around board, I use this everywhere, that makes sense after Hawaii?
A lot of people on tour tend to ride the most high performance boards that are available to them. There are times where I'm not super stoked on that. I always feel like you need to be able to have a groveler in your quiver, and you should always bring that to the beach, or at least leave it in the locker room too. Have it waxed up, prepared, fins in, everything. And I think that's kind of what threw a lot of people off guard when we had to move to Mole Leste too, because Super Tubos can be very tide dependent. On a higher tide, it's a more playful beach break. On a lower tide, you're basically surfing Newport Beach on steroids. The wave's real quick. It has a lot of push. So Joan Duru, I know he's a big fan of the Whiplash model from Mayhem. It's basically like a driver, has a lot of rocker, really manufactures speed and controls it well. It all comes down to the fin use too. But for Griffin, Crosby, I know those guys for a fact were on a driver 3.0. It's the most high-performance board that Mayhem makes right now, and it has a lot of rocker too. So just being able to control that speed, and most importantly, staying in the pocket and surfing in the pocket the whole time, to me was super noticeable on finals day, especially when Griffin was able to beat Ethan Ewing in the final. On the women's side, a lot of the Sharp Eye riders, I know they're a big fan of Toledo's boards, 77 primarily. It's more of a beach break board, high performance, forces you to surf in the pocket too. To me, that's probably the best pick when it comes to surfing a wave like this. It's not like you're going to France and, Hossegor can be very tide dependent too, but it's usually a mushier wave that you're able really to surf as well as you could on. Super Tools is a different animal. It's a wave that really demands you not only pick up your pace throughout the wave. Even Lakey Peterson spoke about it in one of her interviews. This is a wave that's really fast, and my timing was just off the entire time. So need to be surfing something with a lot of rocker. CI Pro, CI 2.0 Pro if you're riding Channel Islands. 77 if you're on the Sharp Eye. I'd say the Driver 3.0 if you're a Mayhem team rider. And for somebody like Paizel, good opportunity to bring out the Red Tiger too, which is one of their most popular models nowadays.
Interesting. And, one of the things that we noticed, and you mentioned it earlier, is Johnny Cabianca Surfboards. He's been building Gabriel's boards forever, right? Since he first splashed onto the scene. And originally from Brazil, but he is actually based out of Europe. And Gabe, being one of the bigger, stronger surfers on tour, people have noticed that historically he's ridden some boards with quite a lot of volume. Did anything stick out to you in terms of what Gabe was riding at the European event? Obviously, he comes to the home region of his Shaper. The factory's there. He's probably getting a fresh quiver. They all looked amazing. What did you notice about Gabe's equipment in particular?
Well, mainly rides roundtails, which is something that he's been doing for, I'd say, the last 8 years, on and off. Before that, he was really a swallowtail guy.
I remember this, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and because of Gabe, I was actually like, hey, I love swallowtails now, and kind of became my thing for a few years. But once he transitioned to, a roundtail, which is, really something that's a lot more stable, I feel like that's something that translated to great surfing on his behalf, given the waves that we have on the Championship Tour. I was there at the ISAs in Puerto Rico, won every single heat he surfed in. He just looked like the best surfer of the event from start to finish. And I believe he was riding a replica of that board in Portugal too, which is a little odd given that the waves are major different. I will have to say, though, it all comes down to the way you're feeling with the equipment that you have under your feet. It might not be the best board or the board that's appropriate for that kind of wave. There are just times where you're in sync. But it's usually a board that has a lot more volume in the chest, so paddling-wise, easy to get into, has a medium rocker, not something that's, too drastic like that. I'd say something that's a bit more balanced. And most importantly, it carries the V throughout the tail at the end too, which just stabilizes everything. If you look at a lot of his stalls on the airs, always putting a lot of emphasis on the back part of the tail, especially on the back end of the tail pad, to be able to control that speed, diminish it, and then recover it once you need to pump down the line again too. That's something that is very particular with beach break boards. So Gabe riding a board that seemed like it was very specific to Super Tubos, and it also seemed like it was riding well at Mole Leste. So a good all-around board, but I think it just comes down to him being a 3-time world champion and one of the best to ever do it too.
That's a good point. We're coming into two venues, Bells Beach and Mainbreak, Margaret River, that throughout the course of their history as CT venues have actually become really synonymous with board design. You had Kelly on the Channel Islands and occasionally on the Simon Andersons at Bells Beach. You have Lisa Anderson on the Channel Islands. You've got Mick Fanning on the DHDs, Steph on the DHDs, Joel Parkinson on the JSs at Bells. You've got John on the Pizell Ghost at Mainbreak and Margaret River. What are your predictions for what we'll see across the Australian leg, and how essential is it? Well, not essential, I guess. How important is it that a lot of these Australian-based shapers have decades of experience at these pretty specific waves?
I get more nervous when you're asking me these questions on the pod rather than working on the broadcast, dude. I swear that a lot of these board questions tend to be very difficult to answer because Bells, first of all, is not necessarily a great wave. It goes from being super hollow on the outside to all of a sudden just being a mush burger. And I can not understate, how important that end section is to a lot of the major scores you're seeing at Bells too. Like they usually say hey, everything needs to be done on the outside, but that's not true at Bells. The inside is just as important as the outside, and we've seen it before, and it reflects in the big scores out there. It's a hard wave to prepare for, and that's why I feel like a lot of the Australian shapers know what they're doing. You mentioned Simon Anderson. Don't think he's going to be in the picture, but that's a guy that if you need to go to and get a little bit of information and collect some information that is valuable based off of that location, go ahead and do it. Call him up, be like, hey, it seems like the forecast is going to be like this. We might be surfing at one spot. We could be surfing at Winky Pop. What do you recommend? Darren Hanley, great shaper at that venue, has had major event wins right there. Molly Picklam has, made it into finals day before multiple times. Obviously, you have Mick Fanning, one of the all-time greats, has been very victorious and, one of the best surfers to ever do it at both Bells and Winky Pop. And I think right now Ethan Ewing is the major catalyst for him on that side. So experience on the Australian side I think is going to be huge. Same thing for Jason Stevenson. The addition of Ramsey Bukiam to the Championship Tour is huge for him. I think Ryan Callanan should also have another major event. He was a runner-up at that wave last year. And on the women's side, it's a little harder to decipher. I mean, spoke about Molly from DHD before, but then outside of that, you don't have a ton of surfers that are really representing the Australian brand. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see a lot of these surfers carrying boards from the United States into waters like this. Even Tyler Wright, she's won the event 2 years in a row, and she's been riding Pizels. But John has a lot of understanding of what Bells and Winky Pop do because he's had John on the side for so many years. So now having the addition of Tyler Wright and kind of getting the comprehension through John Pizell has been major for him. But I still think Australian shapers should prevail over there, and I think that's why they've done so well in the last few years, Dave.
I love it. And I appreciate you calling me out for putting you on the spot. I'm going to do it again, and we're going to do something really silly because we've only finished 3 of the events so far this year. But I want you to take a look at the current top 5 on the men's and women's right now. And let's pretend these top 5 remain come September for the WSL finals. These are the 5 that are in contention for the 2024 world title. If you look at both sides, there's actually no double ups on the men's side, no double ups on the women's side in terms of shapers. You got Griffin Colapinto as a lost team rider, Ethan Ewing, DHD, John Florence, Pizell, Jack Robinson, Sharp Eye, and Baron Mamiya, Channel Islands. And then on the women's side, you've got Molly Picklam, DHD, Joanne Defay, Sharp Eye, Betty Lusakura Johnson. A little bit of a free agent, but we've seen her ride both Pizels and Channel Islands this year. Caitlin Simmers with Chris Borst and the reigning world champ Caroline Marks with Mayhem. All right, tell me who's winning the world title at lower trestles, men's and women's.
Dude, you serious?
Yeah.
We're doing this right now? Oh, my God.
Hey, here's the tip. We're going to do it all season, so...
Oh, top 5 right now for the men. I'm going to go experience. I think John Florence is going to be able to take it out. On the women's side, it's hard for me to bet against Molly right now. She just looks like she's on another level. My heart is saying Molly Picklam. my head saying Caroline Marks, though. I feel
Mm.
like even if she's the number 5 seed, she'll be able to make it all the way to the final and capitalize on that opportunity to compete at home. I mean, she demonstrated last year that she has the capability of doing so. And, regardless if the waves are really good or just average, I think she's still the most complete surfer out of those 5 right there.
I like it. Okay. Well,
Wait, am I only saying them, or are you saying them too?
I was trying to get out of here
No,
before
dude.
that. Well, the reason I
We're doing
brought it
both of
up,
them.
and it's a little bit of recency bias because, Griffin and Ethan had the final together. They're current 1 and 2 on the rankings, and I'm like, oh man, like if this was the top 5 and we're in September, I'm remembering those heats between Ethan and Griffin last September, and Ethan. I mean, I beware the wounded animal, I guess, but was coming off of what we thought was a season-ending broken back, and looked incredible. And I think that his surfing at lower trestles last year, faster, sharper, more powerful, which is saying a lot because Griffin is incredible. But looking at the men right now, I would probably say Ethan would have the advantage. But I'd love to see all of them take a crack. I'm disappointed we don't have
100%.
we don't have any goofy footers on the men's side. We have our queen, our reigning women's world champ, Caroline, on the women's side.
Yeah.
I like your pick with Molly. I think that per what I've seen, the way she surfs lower trestles, I would be interested to see a Molly Picklum win the world title there, because to me that would mean that she's figured something out at lower trestles and she's surfing it even better than she already does. To be clear, she surfs it really, really well, but I don't think she surfs it necessarily better than Katie or Caroline or even Joanne and Betty Lou on their day there right now. But Molly has figured so many things out in such a short amount of time, and her surfing gets so much better, whether it's at Sunset Beach, whether it's at Pipeline, Backdoor, and she's got Glenn Hall in her corner. So to me, that would be exciting because that means that they've figured something out and she's elevated even further at another venue, which isn't really an answer, but I'll stick with Molly on that too. So.
I just want to add something more, if that's
yeah,
okay.
Of course.
Betty Lou Sakura Johnson, Channel Islands, has really made a push to try to acquire her full time now. And Britt was there, in Portugal. I feel like he's made huge strides just overall in terms of getting a better team with Brent Power, the team manager for Channel Islands now. But in terms of board products and production, I mean, they've done an amazing job. And given that she's competed at lowers before, at big amateur events, U.S. champs, I remember she almost got a 10 there one year when she was still in the U18s. She is probably the one person to look out for that could be a wild card of the top 5 standings right now. Real consistent surfer, knows how to surf when it's small, but once it gets a little bigger too, she definitely goes for it. And that quick frontside snap that she has, I think, could be very lethal. But I would have to say, especially when it comes to the Vissla CT Shaper Rankings too, she needs to make a decision on what kind of board she's riding halfway through the year. And if she were to make it into the finals, which seems like a major possibility right now, she needs to have her equipment dialed, just like Brent and Britt did last year with Joao. They brought 10 new boards to the beach days before, and Joao Chianca tried all of those boards out before he decided on his last 4 for finals day. So I think that's a major possibility if Sakura were to be able to make it to the finals and eventually become world champion. I think it would be great, especially for the state of Hawaii, to have a brand new champion outside of Carissa Moore too.
I like it a lot. So we'll put ourselves on the spot the next time we connect if the top 5 change or if our picks have changed, which we reserve the right to change if we want to. So we got one more break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Line Out Podcast. I'm your part-time co-host, Mitchell Salazar, here with the all-time great Dave Proda, now celebrating 18 years at the World Surf League. Congrats, Dave. Want to say a big thank you for your major accomplishments to the sport of surfing and to the league. And let's get into our favorite segment of the pod, our listener question segment. Big thank you to everybody who's written in to at the Lineup Pod. And if we don't get to your question in today's episode, we'll do our best to respond in our DMs as we always do. So, Dave, let's get to it. Our first question from a big-time listener at WillyGoat0230. Sup, boys? How do you think Marissa and Steph's absence will affect the girls this year? That's actually a great question, and we've seen major impacts in the first 3 events, Dave.
Oh, totally. And I think it's something we've been talking about pretty much since the jump, when we talk about it, like generational talent, it cycles and finger in the wind, roughly every 5 years on the men's tour, you see a generational shift. And it doesn't mean that the front runners aren't still the front runners, but you're seeing a generation come in and challenge them. Maybe their approach is different. Maybe, their physicality is different. And on the women's side, I think historically it's been a little bit slower. Instead of 5 years, you could probably say it's closer to 10 years. And so seeing a number of world title holders like your Stephs and your Carissas, who've been on tour for well over a decade, move on and or take a break. We were ready for this, and I think that generation of your Molly Picklums and your Katie Simmers and your Caroline Markses were already on tour, and essentially within days, they established themselves as like, we are now the new benchmark. They did that at Pipeline, they did that at Sunset Beach, they did that in Portugal, and it's been really, really impressive. Looking forward to seeing, of course, what Carissa gets up to now that she's stepped away from full-time competition. Steph Gilmore, it's worth mentioning, she just signed an 8-year, multi-million-dollar contract with Rip Curl, who was her sponsor when she was younger. She then went to Quicksilver Roxy. Now she's back at Rip Curl. She's taking a year off this year to go on the search. She's coming back in 2025 to compete for potentially a 9th world title. So we'll see. We'll see what it looks like when she comes back. But for now, to answer the question, geez, we are seeing the platforming of a new generation of women surfers whose talent is through the roof. I don't know, Mitch, what do you think about that?
I think it's great for the sport. I mean, we talked about it once we wrapped up the finals last year. Since 2007, there had only been 3 women's world champions: Stephanie Gilmore, Carissa Moore, and Tyler Wright. So having Caroline win, it's obviously promoted major elements of surfing outside of the region, but most importantly, people thrive in competition, and it makes things more exciting when people are pushing each other. We see it on the men's side right now. Since Barron won at Pipe, how much has everybody else's game elevated? And I think on the women's side, there's no difference. Molly Picklum, Caitlin Simmers, they are elevating and pushing the sport to new standards and new levels on the women's side. You have Sakura, has been one of the most consistent surfers throughout the first 3 events too. We always knew how talented she was, and especially coming off of a shoulder injury and surgery, by the way, she has looked great in the first 3 events. I also want to give a big shout out to the 2 rookies, Sori Lindblad, Alyssa Spencer. I know they've struggled a little bit, but they have still shown how good they are in certain heats that they've performed on the Championship Tour so far. But I will say, once Steph comes back and with even more motivation, she is going to be really hard to defeat. So I think it's great. I think they're thriving so far. Getting into our second question, Dave, at daniel.fly.mel, M-E-L-L. This is a pretty interesting question. What do you think about Kelly skipping Portugal and scoring Kira?
Well, it's certainly not a new thing. You kindly called out that LinkedIn's reminded everyone I've just finished 18 years on tour. And I think before I started, Kelly has been the next best thing in surfing for 35 years. You could argue it is a crazy thing to say. And he's achieved so much. He's retired a few times. He's stepped away. He's battled different generations of surfers. And, I think we saw that amazingly emotional CT win at Pipeline a couple of years ago in 2022. I'm not saying that's going to be his last CT win, but a lot of folks, certainly in surfing, were wondering if he was going to step away at that point. And I think that Kelly has sort of hinted at this. I think armchair psychologists could probably argue the same. For someone like him, who's wired to do what he did, who's wired to do what he does, who has won so much, achieving something like winning Pipe in 2022 doesn't feel like a bookend necessarily. It feels like, it's like Lestat in Interview with the Vampire after he finally feeds. The fangs come back out. And for someone like Kelly, he's like, no, that's not the end. That means I can win another world title. So I think that has propelled him, certainly through the last couple of years. I think the idea of potentially making the Olympics in Tahiti was also motivating. That didn't pan out for him. And I think when he was given the wild card for the start of this season, I think part of him thought, well, I don't know if this will be my last year. He's currently at the bottom of the rankings. He didn't have a great Hawaiian leg for his standards, didn't go to Portugal. And unless something drastic happens at Bells and Margaret River, we might not see Kelly on tour after relegation. So with regards to skipping Portugal, I understand some of the criticism out there. With regards to scoring Kira, like, good for him. That's amazing. I do think in the past, and he's been really clear on this as well, as far as the validity of his injury, something you have to ask him, but he said in the past, and other surfers have committed the same point, which is just because you're able to surf, pumping Kira and pulling and get barreled, doesn't mean that your body is ready to do battle against the world's best surfers on the championship tour. Those are two different things, which isn't to make excuses, but I just think that's part of it to keep in mind. He may have felt much more comfortable pulling in at Kira than he would have competing in Portugal, and that's up to Kelly. But we'll see. I don't know, Mitch, you're a competitor, so this might hit you a little bit differently. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you said it perfectly right there at the end. Just because he's surfing perfect Kira doesn't mean that he's not in major pain, and remember, this guy's 52 years old now. It's his first major surgery, which is just absurd given the amount of years that he spent on the championship tour, how many different generations that he's had to go through on the CT as well. But look, let me simplify it. Like Richard Nixon did in the 70s when he was president, and he tried to get away with all that scandal and stuff like that, and he was like, I'm the president, I'm above the law. Nobody's above the law in competitive surfing, okay? It's not because he's just Kelly, he can do whatever he wants. Championship tour surfer, you sign the contract, you know what your obligations are. If you don't want to surf, you don't necessarily have to surf. That spot's going to go to somebody else. So he can take a step back if he wants, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that he's going to get a wild card at the back end of the year. So, there's probably two events where he's going to get a spot in. I would think Tahiti and Fiji, just because historically he's so good there. But outside of that, if he's ready to call it quits or just say, hey, like, if I have to go to the Challenger Series, if I truly want it, I'll do it. But at this point, I just feel like Kelly is going to do whatever he wants. He's been through so much. It's like, why are you going to blame him for wanting to not do that event if you saw the forecast, if that's what he truly said? We're just speculating here. And then he saw the forecast for Kira, and he's like, I know I'm in major pain, but I want to surf perfect waves. I'll go ahead and do it. Who cares? Let Kelly do whatever he wants. We're focusing on the championship tour, but we saw Griffin win his second event in 30 years in Portugal, and Gabe come back in historic fashion. Joanne Defay won her first major event in Europe. Like, those are things that I'd rather focus on rather than seeing, like, hey, Kelly, oh, he surfed Kira and he didn't go to the CT. It's like, dude, who cares? Move on. Like, Kelly's been doing this for 35 years. Like, let him do whatever he wants, But that's just me.
Let me ask you this, because I'm curious to get your take on this too. And our colleague Strider Wazalewski, he's known Kelly for a long time. They were Quicksilver teammates together. Strider's on the commentary team. Strider posted a shot at Kelly at Kira, and he said something to the effect of, if the forecast was pumping at every spot on the championship tour, Kelly's still so good he'd be in the world title race. Respectfully, I don't necessarily agree with that. I understand the thinking. He is amazing. He's achieved more than any other surfer on the planet. But all those surfers you just named, your Griffins and your Ethans and your Jacks and your Barons and your Johns, I'm missing people, but like every single one of them, at Bells Beach, at Margaret River, at Pipeline, at Sunset Beach, in Portugal, in Tahiti. Yes, in some of these locations, if it's firing, Kelly is a favorite. But he's not the favorite, I don't think, anymore. I really think this generation has proven, hey, we've taken everything he's built and we've built upon it. And so I understand the myth making about, hey, he's not getting beaten off tour, he's electing to leave the tour, but I don't necessarily agree with that. I think he's being beaten off tour, and I don't think that's sad necessarily. I think it's amazing that he's still in the mix. I just think that's such a proof point to the generation right now leading the rankings that they've elevated so much, in a way that past generations haven't. I don't know about you. What do you think about that, Mitch?
I fully agree. And I mean, they've elevated so much because of Kelly.
Yeah.
Because of the people that were competing against Kelly generations ago. And yeah, I don't think that he's necessarily a title contender given the talent that we have nowadays. That's just physically, these guys are able to do certain things that Kelly's body isn't able to do anymore. I think at certain locations, he's still a favorite to win major events. If Pipe's firing, I'd put him up there, top 5 contender for sure. I think Fiji is also another great event for him. Tahiti, he was pissed last year when he lost to Yago in a really close heat. But Yago had a chance to make it into the finals, really needed to make that heat to have a chance, and got knocked out at the end. But I just don't think that Kelly's necessarily a top 5 world title contender anymore. I think if the waves are good, his motivation maybe changes a little bit more. But and I know he doesn't like losing. Nobody does. He hates losing. I probably think Kelly hates losing more than he loves winning. That's how competitive that guy is. But I just don't think that he's a world championship contender anymore. No. So Strider, we love you, but I think you need to let your personal affection to Kelly a little bit to the side now.
What do the kids say? They say, stop the cap, right? Where it's like, stop the cap, buddy. Cap hit.
Our last question, at Tree Hat J. Now moving into the Oz leg, do you think the Aussie Shapers have an advantage? Talked about it a little earlier. We can go further in depth into it, Dave.
We did. I felt like I feel bad because I stole this really good question. I feel like I asked you this, and I love the way you articulated it. I think if you look at the current Vissla CT Shaper rankings, like the true Australian-based shapers currently on the rankings, you've got Darren Hanley, DHD, based on the Gold Coast. You've got JS, Jason Stevenson, also based on the Gold Coast. And those are it. Of course, you have Sharp Eye with Brendan Leckie is out there. Lost has facilities out there. Channel Islands, Paizel, they all do. It's such a major surfing market. And I feel like you answered it really well. I think those shapers certainly understand the nuances of both venues. They have deep roots with their teams and people who have performed there in the past really well that their current team riders can tap into. I think DHD, I think we talked about it before the season. He's so motivated. He really wants to win, the shaping world title. He wants to be the 2024 CT Shaper of the Year. He has an amazing team, and I can see him and that team bouncing back. What I'd love to see, and I know we talked about this last year, is sort of the awakening of the sleeping dragon in JS Industries. They have had such a good team for so long, but so many of their team riders are no longer on tour, right? They got Joel Parkinson, Julian Wilson, Mark Occhilupo, Connor Coffin, Dusty Payne, Mikey Wright, Ace Buchan, Dean Morrison. It goes on and on and on. Like, it was such an amazing team over the last couple of decades. And now they've got Samuel Pupo, Frederica Marias, Ramsey Bukayam, Ryan Callanan. It's an awesome team. And I would just love for them to pick up a bit of momentum. Maybe that happens in Australia, and get them back in the mix, because I think that's one thing I'd love to see, in addition to Sharp Eye, in addition to Lost,
True.
in addition to DHD and Paizel, is to see JS kind of step into the ring too, because when they're on, they're on. I don't know, but why don't you should reiterate your answer from before, because I thought you spelled it out really well on the Australian Shaper front.
But that's a great point you make about JS, because that guy was like the shaper back then. And he just wants to be relevant, and I think he did so well in opening up the market in Brazil by adding Sam to the team, having Miguel now. That was huge, because it's a market that he hadn't explored up until right now. Every other major surf brand, in terms of shapers and board builders, they've already had that expansion into Brazil before. We're talking about DHD, Sharp Eye, obviously Marcio, even though he's originally from Brazil, really his manufacturer is in San Diego, California. So his major market has always been the United States up until he got Felipe. Now he opened up Brazil again, has a ton of riders since. But I think for somebody like Matt Biolas, Jason Stevenson being well and being relevant, it pushes you to elevate your game too. And, to answer the question, I do think that Australian shapers should thrive at home. I think the lack of the event of the Gold Coast being on the Championship Tour anymore really takes away from how good we used to see a lot of those shapers perform over there, especially Darren Hanley. I mean, he had major events with Mick. Stephanie Gilmore is obviously the queen of Snapper Rocks, and she can do everything out there and catch any wave that she wants. I thought Jason Stevenson was always one of the most relevant guys there. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of international shapers become one with a lot of these locations that they're going to, and their surfers are prevailing, just like John Florence at Margaret River. There's nobody better than John at Mark's main break than him. And I want to bring up another point too. I think Sharp Eye, having a lot of surfers from diverse parts of the world, also makes them an international brand and almost even an Australian brand too, because they have had Jack Robinson on their team for many years now. And how successful has he been at different parts of the world with those boards? So that's where you're really seeing results happen. When you're seeing one person have good results worldwide, just like Sally did for many years, just like Carissa has had for many years too, and obviously now something that we're seeing at the top with Griffin Colapinto on the men's side too.
Well made point right there. And I think that's a good as place as any to end this episode of The Lineup. Mitch, thank you so much for coming on. The upcoming Rip Curl Pro Bells Beach, stop number 4 on the 2024 WSL Championship Tour season, opens its competition window on March 26th. The event will stream live at worldsurfleague.com and the WSL app. Get your fantasy teams set up. Mitch, you and I will be watching it very closely. And yeah, man, look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.